As you can see on the screen, we have a very basic HTML document. We have the body, we have two inputs, that is two text boxes, and then we have a button. And on the on click, we are calling this add values function, which is basically taking the value from text1 and text2 and just concatenating it over here, you can see. And if you just want to see an example, let me just show it to you. If I write ABC, I write XYZ over here, and if I say add, you can see result is ABC and XYZ. So when you enter this value, it is taken in as a string, stored it in this variable A and B, and then we just perform the addition. That is the concatenation when it comes to string. Okay, so this was very basic. We've seen such kind of examples in the previous videos. So now coming to the topic of the web developer tools that are provided by the browser itself. So almost all the modern browsers come with developer tools and the console wherein you can perform basic debugging. So in Google Chrome, if you hit F12 on a Windows machine, you'll get the Chrome developer tools, and I don't really know what the shortcut is for Mac, but I'll just put it on the screen if I find it out. So if I hit F12 on the Google Chrome, you can see there is a window popping out over here. So let me just make this entire Chrome tab full screen. So let me just zoom in on this entire tab. So I'm just going to select this and I'm going to say Control++ so that it is properly visible in the video. So the first tab is the Elements tab, and this Element tab gives you the entire document in the coding format. So this is exactly what we've typed in the Visual Studio Code also. So let me just switch it to that. So this entire HTML code or this entire HTML document is what is seen in this HTML Elements tab in the developer tools. So if you just expand this head node, you can see that you can also see the entire script that we've just typed in over here. Okay, so this is the first Elements tab. Then we have the console tab, but that is something which we have over here also at the bottom. So this is that console where you can perform debugging, where you can see some real-time output. So if you click on it, you get a dedicated console also. And then one last tab is the sources tab, wherein again you get 3 different windows. So for the first one, we have the entire document, that is default.html. So you can see the address also, it's running on our server 127.0.1. So that is because I'm using the live server plugin. If you haven't used it, you will probably see a complete file hierarchy over here. Then here we have certain breakpoints which are basically used to perform live debugging. So if you've used Java in NetBeans or C# in the Visual Studio or some other proper IDE, you must be knowing that we can go step by step and perform debugging, and then we have an option to step ahead into the entire code and perform debugging in the live scene, right? So that same functionality can be done in JavaScript using this web dev tools. So that is really helpful. So yes, we'll take a very basic example of that debugging also. But right now this is how your web dev tools looks like. Let's get acquainted with it. So we've seen Elements tab in the web dev tools, wherein you can see the entire structure of the HTML document. If you just hover on it, you can see it is getting highlighted also. That is, the individual HTML elements are getting highlighted. You can also see the script, and then the console is something that you can do some live stuff over here. So you can say 5 plus 6, and if you see, you are getting an output of 11. If you hit enter, you get 11, and then you can do some basic mathematics stuff over here. This is just for you doing some experiments. But let's move to the code and let's see the console.log function, which will actually help us see some output on the console. So right now in the code, what I'm doing is I'm just taking A and B and I'm printing it on this label, right? So this is that label, and I'm changing the inner HTML property. So the label is this h2 tag. It's not a label, it's a heading 2 tab with an ID of OP. So I'm accessing it over here by using the get element by ID, and I'm changing the inner HTML value. Okay. So instead of this, if I just wanted to see the output on the console, we have a function which comes with console.log, and then you can do a plus b over here, and now the output will be seen on the console. So this console is a DOM object which gives us access to this entire console on the website. And since JavaScript is an object-oriented programming language, this console is basically an object which can access this entire console on the web development tools. And then it has certain methods along with it. So this log is just one method. It has multiple methods. I'll drop some links in the video description if you want to explore more on this. So if I just comment this out and keep this as it is, let's see if this works. So I'm going to say ABC and I'm going to say XYZ. When I say add, you can see on the console it is getting printed, right? So let me just zoom in a little bit more. So this is that output. Okay. So this is another way wherein you can see some output on the console, and then you can actually make it live. because you don't want to print it on your website or the web document directly. You might want to first test it out on your console and then you can print it in the output. Okay, so this is one way to see output using JavaScript. So the next thing that you can do is you can perform some basic debugging on the console also. So coming to the code, let's say if you miss out some basic syntax. Okay, so if I just cut this out, you can see I'm getting an error over here in the text editor itself. But some errors are undetected by the text editor. So let's say I'm going to be printing it on the screen. That is, I'm going to print the addition or concatenation of A and B in the h2 tag over the results, right? So let's say A and B or A and B, and if I hit add, I'm getting AB. But now in the coding, I just miss out this plus. Okay, so you can see in the text editor, it is not getting highlighted. We are not getting any errors and we cannot visually see this. So we are not sure where we have exactly made a mistake. Now if I try to add A and B and if I say add, I'm not getting any output. So if you're wondering, okay, what exactly has happened, there is no way to find out from the text editor, right? So let's say this is a 1000-line code of JavaScript. So where exactly are you going to find out the mistake, right? So this is where you can see in the console, we've got a issue, uncaught reference error, AB is not defined. And then it gives us exactly where the problem is. So default.html at line number 10. So this 10 represents the line number. Okay. And it is happening on onClick, right? So when you call the onClick event, our custom function is called. So if I click on this, it will directly take me to the line where exactly the error is happening. And you can see it is also getting highlighted. So it goes under the sources tab in the default.html and it is showing me where exactly the error is happening. So in the code, I can go ahead and I can see, okay, I forgot a plus sign over here. I can change it over here. And then this is where exactly I can find my mistake very easily because the output is shown on the console. Okay, so this was one more thing that you can do to perform debugging in a fast way. So now you can do little more things also. You can enhance this and you can do that live debugging also. So for that, if you go under the sources tab, you can see we have certain things like breakpoints. We have XHR fetch breakpoints, DOM breakpoints, global listeners, event listeners. So we'll not look into all of these as of now. Let's go to the event listeners. And if you scroll down, you can see that we have different events happening on the screen. So we've talked about events, right? So we have click events, we have scroll events, we have some manipulation events, and there are n number of events. As you can see, we have different types over here. So right now we are interested in the mouse event and especially we are interested in the click event because when we click on the button, what we are calling is an on-click event, right? So just select this and what exactly this is doing is this will perform live debugging. So now if I type in some values, I say Tanmay and space Sakpal, that's my name. And now if I click on this button, you can see that it is paused in debugger, which means this area becomes gray and now we have come and this line gets highlighted. So this is where the on click has happened and right now what is being called is add values function. So now we have different options over here. You can see these signs. We have step into next function call. We have step out of the current function and we have step. So when we click on step, we will go one step ahead. That is, we will go to the add values function, right? So if I click on it, you can see the control is transferred inside this function. And right now, if you hover on this variable a, it is showing undefined. But if I click on step again, or if I click F9, now you can see a has become Tanmay because that's what I have entered over here. And you can see now variable a is holding value of Tanmay. If you just hover on it, you can see that value. Similarly, if I step one more ahead, b value holds Sakpal. So I can see live what is happening step by step. And this is a functionality which we have in NetBeans IDE when you do Java programming, or this is also there in C# when you do .NET programming in Visual Studio and many other IDEs, but this is not there directly in the text editor Visual Studio. I suppose we probably might have some plugin for this, but this can be done in web dev tools and most professional developers do use this web dev tools because there is a lot more than just this, but this is at a very basic level that you can do. So again, going ahead, you can see the output is being printed over here and in the output you can see result equals to Tanmay Sakpal. So right now we have just commented the console.log, so that's why the function is completely over. And if you again step ahead, our function is basically done, right? So this was another example wherein you can just track a particular event. So you can do multiple events. You can select a lot of them together if you're watching different events. Right now we just did it at a very basic level. You can individually mark some debugging points also. So let's say you want to start debugging from this point. So you can do that. So you can see paused in debugger. So you come directly at this point. Then you go ahead step by step by using the step function. If you want to step out of this function, you can select this step out of current function and it completely takes you out of that function. And then there are a lot of things that you can experiment around. I just wanted to show you at a very basic level how you can perform basic debugging and how the console.log function can help you see some output on the console wherein you can see if there is an error happening or not. So in this video, we are going to be taking a look at 4 different methods: the set timeout method, clear timeout method, set interval, and clear interval. So let's first take a look at the first one, that is the set timeout method. Now it allows you to execute statements once after a particular interval. Okay. So let's say in your program, what you want to do is you want to perform some function or you want to perform some activity, but you only want to do that after a particular set of time. Let's say you want to perform a function. Let's say when I click on this start button, you have to perform some activity, but after 10 seconds or after 5 seconds. So this is where you can use the set timeout method because it allows you to execute particular statements, basically a function or a set of statements, only once after a particular interval. So now here what we'll try to do is when I click on start, we will try to print some text after 3 seconds have passed. Okay. And then when I click on stop, we'll add some more functionality using the clear timeout. So you'll see that when we move ahead. Let's first try to add some feature to the start button. So as you can see on the screen, we have a basic HTML document. We have the body, we have 2 buttons, and on click we are calling the start function, and for the stop button we are calling the stop function. And then in between we have this h2 tag which is showing this some text. So coming back to the JavaScript code, let's first create a function which will print some message. So I'm going to say function print msg, that is print message. Inside that I'm going to say document dot get element by id. I'm going to get the element of the h2 tag which is op over here. I'm going to copy this and paste it. I'm going to say dot inner html and I'm going to say 5 seconds have passed. So this function I want to call after 5 seconds have passed, right? So now let's create the start function. I'm going to say function start, and inside this function what we have to use is the set timeout function. Now this set timeout method is basically coming from the window object, and we've not really talked about window object. So if you've seen the video on document object model in this playlist, we saw that there is a hierarchy of objects and document object sits on top of the entire hierarchy. However, there is one more object which is basically the window object, which represents the entire window inside which the HTML document or any other document is loaded. So the window is basically one step above the document object, but we did not take that into consideration because that is not directly used. We most probably use the document object mostly, but some features and some functionality which is provided by the window object. So this method, that is set timeout method, comes from the window object. So I can say window.setTimeout. Now it expects 2 arguments. The first one is the reference to the function or the piece of code that you want to call or perform. So the first one is the function and the second one is the time interval after which you want to execute that function. So that is in milliseconds. So in this case we want to call the function print message. So I'm going to copy this and paste it over here, and we have to call it after 5 seconds, right? So I'm going to pass 5000 because this has to be in milliseconds. Now notice that I did not add the brackets over here, so I'm not giving a function call over here. What I'm giving is a reference to this function. Okay, so there is a difference between passing the reference and giving a function call. So when I do this, I'm just saying that refer this function and call it after 5000 milliseconds or 5 seconds. So let's see if this works. I'm going to click on start because on the button on click event we are calling this start function, which will indirectly call print message using the set timeout method of the window object, and this will be done after 5 seconds. So let's count 5 seconds. I'm going to click start and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and there you go, we got the output that 5 seconds have passed. So this was set timeout. Now what if you want to actually stop this feature in between? So let's say you click the button and then you realize, okay, you've made some mistake in the print message and you want to stop it. So this is where the clear timeout method comes into picture. Okay, so let's add the stop functionality also. So I'm just gonna copy this and paste it over here and just change the start to stop, and here I'm gonna say window dot clear timeout. Okay, now this clear timeout method of the window object expects one argument which is basically a unique ID. So this ID is set when you actually set the inbuilt timer. So there is something which is known as a timer which works behind the scenes to set this timer or set this timing. So that timer is an inbuilt implementation in the browser which takes care of this scheduling time. So what it does is that timer has a unique ID, and whenever you say set timeout, the timer is set with a unique ID. So that unique ID is returned from this method. So what you can do is you can create a variable. I'm going to say var ID. I'm going to set it to 0 initially, and I can say ID equals to, and now this ID variable that we created will store the unique ID of that timer, and that ID is required when you want to clear that timer or reset that timer, you can say, or you can stop it. Okay, so when I say clear timeout, I'm basically stopping that timer from actually executing this print message if I do it before 5 seconds. So let's see if this works, and you can confirm it by clicking on the start, and before 5 seconds pass, if we click on the stop and this text does not change, it will mean that our clear timeout method has worked perfectly fine, right? So let's click on this and count 5, and before we reach 5 we will click on stop and we will see if clear timeout has worked. So I'm clicking on start, 1, 2, 3, and I'm clicking on stop now, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. You can see that the seconds have passed, but 5 seconds have passed, text did not show up over here, which means that our clear timeout worked perfectly fine. If I just comment this out and again try it out, let's say start, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you can see we got our text. So since I had commented this text or this line of code, the clear timeout was not called and we got the message. So I hope you got the idea of why we need clear timeout. If you want to stop the functionality which was set by the set timeout method, you can do it, but you need the ID of that timer because you have to pass that ID in the clear timeout method. So these were the first two methods. Let's move on to the next two, that is set interval and clear interval. So now set interval allows you to execute statements repeatedly after an interval. So set timeout was helping you to execute a statement or execute a function only once after a delay, right? After 5 seconds we were able to call the print message only once. But what if you want to call the print message over and over again after every 5 seconds? So this is where the set interval method comes into picture, and using this you can actually create a basic timer, or you can also create animations. So in this video what we'll do is we'll create a basic timer. So what we'll do is we'll change the text to 1 second, 2 second, 3 second after every second has passed. So I have to use the set interval. So first what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a variable named seconds. I'm going to initialize it to 0. In the print message what I'm going to do is I'm going to just say seconds, which is this variable that we created, and in the text I'm going to say seconds. Okay, so this will actually have the value and then this will be just the text, and we will call this print message over and over again using the set interval method. Okay, so again set interval and clear interval are also methods of the window object. So when I click on start, we are calling this start function. Inside the start function we have to first call the set interval method. So I'm going to just copy this and paste it over here. And again set interval also expects two arguments. The first argument is the reference to the function or the line of codes that we want to execute over and over again, and the second argument is again milliseconds. So pretty much the same like set timeout, but just the difference is now print message is gonna be printed over and over again after every 5 seconds, but we want it to repeat after every 1 second. So I'm gonna pass 1000 milliseconds. So let's see if this works. I'm gonna click on start and there you go, 0 second. But right now you can see that it is not incrementing because we actually made a mistake over here, because we also actually want to increment the value of seconds, right? So in the entire code we forgot to actually increment the seconds value. So we have to actually increment it over here only. So I'm going to say seconds plus plus. So this is something that we forgot. So whenever this function is going to be called, it is going to print the value of current seconds. It will add 1, and after 1 second again it will be called, and since seconds is a global variable, the value will be retained, right? So let's see if this works. I'm going to click on start. So 0 seconds, 1 second, 2 second, 3 seconds. So as you can see our timer is going on and on because we've started it. So right now if I click on stop, you can see the timer has stopped. Okay, so even by using clear timeout you can actually stop it, but to clear the interval we actually use this clear interval method and not clear timeout. I don't know how that worked, but yeah, again the same mechanism. When you set the interval for the timer, a unique ID of that timer is returned from this method, which is stored in this ID variable, and then when you want to stop that timer, you use the clear interval method and pass that same ID. Okay, so that's why I've kept this ID also as global variable. So again, just showing you one more time, I'm going to click on start. Our timer will start 0 seconds, 1 second, 2 second, 3 second, and so on. and then when you click on stop, it will stop. If you start again, it will start from the same value because these are global values and the document is still loaded. If I refresh it, it will start from 0 again. If I click on stop again, it will stop. So yeah, this was set timeout, clear timeout, set interval, clear interval at a very basic level. These are some timing functions which are predefined and provided in JavaScript to directly use, and you can use them to create a basic timer functionality. So let's say you're creating an application which is taking some online exams and you want to have a timer which runs for a particular amount of time. So you can use this set interval function to create that timer. So what we are going to be doing is when I click on this fade out button, this image that is being shown over here will slowly fade out and it will create a smooth transition. And when I click fade in, it will come back in a very smooth way in a fade in transition. Okay. So that's the entire purpose of this video, and that's what we are going to be doing. So as you can see in the body, you can see we have a button which says fade out, and on click we are calling the fade out function, which we will create in the script tag in the JavaScript. Then we have an image with the ID img1, and I have loaded an image which is in the images folder, and the name of the image is simplesnippets.png, and I've given it a basic width. And lastly we have the third button which is fade in, and on click we are calling fade in, and that function we have to create in JavaScript. So let's get started with the coding of this basic animation, and now we are getting into animations. And again, if you have missed the previous video of the timing functions, do watch that because we are directly going to be using those methods over here. So starting off in the script tag, what I've done is I've created two variables. One is opacity and I've set the value to 0, and the second one is interval ID. So when we are going to be stopping the timer, that is when the animation is done, we have to stop the timer from calling the function over and over again, right? So we are going to be using the interval ID, and this is something that we saw in the previous video. And the opacity variable is what we are going to be manipulating. So this image has an attribute of opacity. Okay, so if you go ahead in the images and if you say style, if you're just performing inline CSS, and if you say opacity colon, and if I say 0.5 or 0.4, you can see the image gets faded out, right? So the opacity value, that is this attribute or this CSS style of this image tag, ranges from 0 to 1. Okay, so if I say 0.1, it will be very faded. You can see you cannot even see it barely. So if you say 0.9, it becomes much more clearer, and if you say 1, it's completely visible. So what we are going to be doing is we are going to be taking this opacity value and we are going to be calling a function over and over again, and every time that function is called, we are going to be reducing this opacity value by some value, that is 0.1. So we are going to be subtracting 0.1 every time for the fade out, and we are going to be adding 0.1 for the fade in. Okay, so you'll understand that when we actually type in the code, but right now that's the reason why I've created this opacity variable. So let's start off with the programming. Let's first create the fade in and fade out functions. So let's start off with fade out. I'm going to say function fade out. Now inside this, I'm going to be calling the set interval function or the set interval method. Now the set interval method requires two parameters. The first one is the function reference. So let's say this is hide, and we have to separately create the hide function also. And I'm going to pass 20 milliseconds over here. Okay. Now when we call this set interval function, it returns us a ID, a unique ID of the timer, which is set internally and which schedules this hide function over and over again. So we have to store that ID. So I'm going to store that ID in this interval ID variable that we have created. Okay. So when I click on fade out, that is when I click on this button, the on click event is going to be called and the fade out function will be called. And in the fade out function, we will call the set interval method, which will schedule the timer to call hide method after every 20 milliseconds. Okay, so this is the idea. So we have to also create the hide function. So let's create the hide function. So I'm going to say function hide. So this is where the entire coding of the animation is going to happen. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to access this image tag using the document.getElementById. So I'm going to say var img is equal to document.getElementById. I'm going to pass the ID of the image. The ID of the image is img1. You can see over here. So the next thing is we want to access the opacity of this image, right? So now this is a JavaScript variable image, which is pointing to this HTML element, right? So we can access the properties by using the style tag or the style attribute. So I could have said document.getElementById.style.opacity, right? But opacity is something which is handled differently in different browsers. So we cannot directly use this getElementById. So we have to use another way. So since we have created a opacity variable over here, what we'll do is we'll say opacity is equal to window dot get computed style. We're going to be passing this image object which points to the image attribute, and I'm going to say dot get property value, and inside this I'm going to say opacity. So this is a workaround to get the opacity value indirectly. We have to use the window object and we have to say get computed style, and we have to pass the object, or we have to pass the HTML element reference of which the opacity is supposed to be wanted, and then we have to say dot get property value, and inside that we have to pass opacity. Okay, so this is something you have to do to fetch the opacity, and this will give us the current opacity. But right now you can see that the image is having opacity as 1 because it is completely visible. So initially when you call the hide the first time, the opacity value is going to be equal to 1, right? Now this function returns the opacity, but it is in a string format. So to convert this into number, we can use a number constructor function, and we have to wrap this entire code inside this number constructor function. So if you just hover on it, you can see it returns a number, and it is a number constructor function. Okay, so this is how you convert basic string to numbers. You can do some other methods also. There are other methods also in which you can convert a string to a number, but this is something that we are going to be using. And now our opacity value will have a number variable which initially is going to be 1. Okay, so what we have to do is, now we have to check if the opacity value is greater than 0. So I'm going to say if opacity is greater than 0, we have to bring it to 0, right? Because we are going to be performing hide. So when we are performing hide, we want to get the opacity to 0 from 1. So we will say opacity is equal to opacity minus 0.1. So every time this hide function is going to be called after 20 milliseconds, the opacity value is going to be reduced by 0.1. Okay, and once it reaches 0, so in the else part, that is when the opacity is 0, we will stop this, or we will clear this interval, right? So we have to say clear interval, and inside this we have to pass the interval ID. Now we also have to do one thing, that once we reduce the opacity value, we have to set this new opacity to this image also, right? So this is something that we can do directly. We can say image dot style dot opacity equals to this opacity variable. So setting the opacity is straightforward. You can directly do image dot style dot opacity or document dot get element by ID, and then you can say dot style dot opacity and set the new opacity. But to fetch the opacity, you have to use this workaround method, because as I mentioned, opacity values are handled differently in different browsers and different situations. So now let's see if this works. This is our complete hide function, which will be called after every 20 milliseconds because we are doing it via the set interval method, and this will stop only when the opacity value reaches 0. Okay, so let's click on fade out and let's see if this works. And there you go, you can see our code completely worked perfectly fine. Let's actually see it in a little slower way. Let's say 200 milliseconds. So this hide method will now be called after 200 milliseconds and not 20 milliseconds. So the transition will be very slow. Let's click on fade out, and you can see that it is fading out slowly and it is now gone. So if you increase this number, the transition will happen slowly. If you want it to happen smoothly, you give a lower number and then it happens smoothly. So similarly, let's create the code for fade in. So we have to create one more function named fade in, because that's what we are calling over here. So I'm just going to change this fade out to fade in. Again, set the interval ID, and instead of hide, I'm going to say show. Okay, so let's create this show function. So I'm going to say function show. Now the code inside the show is also going to be pretty much similar to this. So I'm just going to copy this entire hide function and paste it inside this show. But the only thing that is going to be changing is, here we are going to be checking for if opacity is less than 1, because when we are showing or when you are revealing the image, our opacity is already become 0, right? And we have to go from 0 to 1. So instead of going from 1 to 0, we have to go from 0 to 1, and that's why we have to add 0.1 at every iteration. Okay, that's the only change in the show function. And now let's see if the show function works, because we've already called fade in over here, and what fade in does is it sets the interval and sets the timer to call show after every 20 milliseconds, and this will go on and on until the opacity value becomes 1. Once the opacity value becomes 1, we call clear interval, so the function stops calling itself. Okay, so let's see. First we'll do fade out. The image got faded out. Let's see fade in, and there you go, we got our image back. And again, you can change and play around with the timing. This is in milliseconds. If you want slower transitions, you can increase the number. If you want faster, you can reduce the number. And one more thing that you can do is you can also see the opacity values using the console.log. So what we'll do is let's try to use the console.log function or log method to see the opacity values. So I'm going to use this in show as well as hide over here. And in our browser, click F12 to open the dev tools. We've already seen a dedicated video on what are dev tools and how to use it. So let's click on fade out, and there you go, you can see these values. And once it becomes 0, we call clear interval, right? So no more console values are printed. Let's click on fade in, and there you go, you can see after 0 we got 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, 0.4, 5, 6, 7 till 1. So this is how you can track down the opacity values also using the console. I just wanted to show you can do something like this. As you can see on the screen, I have a simple heart image which we are going to be scaling up and scaling down. So it will be creating effect of heartbeat or heartbeat pumping. So I think that will look pretty cool once we get with the coding. So in the coding part right now, what we have is our basic HTML body. We have 2 breaks so that the heart comes a little bit down. And then I have a simple image which is having an ID of img1, and I'm loading this image from the images folder, and the image name is heart.png. You can load any image, you can download it from the internet. So this is that image in the folder, and this is our default.html file. So I'm loading it from the images folder. Okay, so I've given it a basic width of 100, and in the JavaScript we still have to write down the entire code of zooming in or scaling in and scaling out. Okay, so this is something that we're going to be doing, and we are going to be needing the timing functions, that is the set interval and clear interval. So if you have missed that video in this playlist, go check that out because that is important. Okay, so let's get started with the coding, and what I'm going to do is, in this case I'm not going to be having any button to scale in and scale out. We're going to be using the mouse on over event and mouse on out. Okay, so on mouse over and on mouse event. So we've seen this events in the previous tutorials also. So basically this event is called whenever our mouse pointer comes in on the image, and whenever you remove this mouse pointer from the image, the mouse on out event is called. Okay, so just to check this, you can add 2 alerts. So I can say alert, I can say on mouse over, copy this, and here also I can say on mouse out. So this is just popping out alert messages to check the on mouse over and on mouse events. So if I come and hover it on over, you can see on mouse over called. If I say okay, on mouse out called because I moved out from the heart, right? So once you go outside from this image, the on mouse out is also called. Okay, so this means this is working. So right now what I'm calling is increase function and decrease function, which we have to create in the JavaScript. So let's get started with that. So let's start off with increase function. So in increase we are going to be performing scaling, obviously. That is, we will perform scaling in. So let's do that. So I'm going to say function increase. Inside this we are going to be calling the set interval method. So I'm going to say set interval. Set interval method requires 2 parameters. The first one is a reference to a function, and the second one is the interval time in milliseconds. So I'm going to say zoom in, and I'm going to say 20 milliseconds. Okay, so this zoom in is another function which we have to create, inside which we will have the code of the increasing of the width. So we're going to be changing the width at every iteration. So this is the idea over here. So let's create this zoom in function also. So I'm going to say function zoom in. Now here what we have to do is we have to check the width of the image. Okay, so initially as you can see we have set the width value as 100, and this is something that we are setting to the image also, but this line of code is not being executed because this has to happen on some event, right? So if you comment it out, it won't have any effect on the code. Actually I just wrote it because this is something that we're going to be using in the code. So now what we're going to be doing is, we know that when we have initially loaded it, we know that the width is 100 because we have explicitly set it over here. You can change it from here also and the image will increase, but right now let's keep it 100 pixels. So in the zoom in function, what we have to do is we have to check for this width value. So we're going to say if width is less than 200, we have to say width is equal to width plus difference. So this difference is another variable and the value is 2. So what we are going to be doing is, every time zoom in function is going to be called after 20 milliseconds, the width value is going to be increasing by 2 units, that is 2 pixels. And initially the width value is 100, right? So after first iteration, the width will be 100 plus difference, which is 2, 102. Then again zoom in will be called after 20 milliseconds. It will be checked. So 102 is less than 200. So again 2 will be added into that value, right? And then we also have to use this document.getElementById to set the new width, right? So this is something that we'll do over here. And once it reaches the 200 mark, that is once the width of the image reaches 200, we want to clear this interval also, because otherwise this set interval will keep on calling zoom in after every 20 milliseconds. So something has to stop it. So this is where the interval ID comes into picture. So I'm going to create one more variable, interval ID, set it to 0 initially, and this set interval will return the interval ID of the timer which is set inbuilt, which schedules this zoom in after every 20 milliseconds. So in order to stop that timer, we have to use this interval ID in the else part of the zoom in function, and we have to say clear interval and pass the interval ID. So this is something that we've seen in the timing functions, that is clear interval and set interval functions. So let's see if this works. Right now what we are calling is on mouse over, we are calling the increase function. So this increase function has only one line of code which sets the timer for 20 milliseconds and it calls in zoom in after every 20 milliseconds. And in the zoom in function, what we are doing is we are checking the width. If it is less than 200, we are increasing it by 2 units or 2 pixels. We are setting that new width to the image by using the document.getElementById.style.width property. And once it reaches 200, we are clearing the interval. So we will stop the timer from calling the zoom in function. So let's see, let's try to hover on the image, and there you go, you can see it got increased, right? So it was 100 initially, it became 200. Now if you want to check for this value, you can use the console.log again. So I'm going to say console.log. Inside I'm going to pass this width. Coming on the browser, hit F12 and you can see the console being loaded over here. Now if you hover on the image, you can see the console values go till 200, right? And we got an uncaught exception because we still have to define the on mouse out event. So we have not created the decrease function yet, right? So that's why this error was coming. Otherwise you can see this value 200. After 200 it stops. So now let's create the decrease function also. So like function increase, we can go ahead and create the decrease function also. Inside this, instead of zoom in, we have to say zoom out. Again 20 milliseconds for that. So we still have to create the zoom out function. So just like zoom in, we have to create zoom out also. So I'm just gonna copy paste this entire zoom in and just replace it with the name of zoom out. But here we have to check for the width being greater than 100. Okay, so if the width is greater than 100, we have to bring it back to 100, right? Instead of zoom in and zoom out, you can say expand and shrink, you know. This makes more sense and it is more readable. So here I'm going to change zoom in to expand and here zoom out to shrink. Okay, so in shrinking we have to reduce the size. So we have to check if the width is greater than 100, we have to bring it back to 100, right? So I'm going to say width is equal to width minus the difference and set this width to that image using the document.getElementById, and we'll also log it in the console. So let's see if this works. So I'm going to hover on it, it increases to 200. I'm going to remove the mouse from the image now and you can see it goes back to 100. So our basic animation is done, but there is an issue over here which we still haven't figured out. I'm going to show it to you. If I hover it and before increasing to its full size, if I remove the mouse, so let me just show you. If I do this and if I just remove it, you can see it becomes a little weird. It keeps on pulsating, and that is because the set interval has been set, the timer has been set, but clear interval did not get called. So just notice in the code, the clear interval is only called when the width reaches 200. But in this case, what I did is I did not let it reach 200, right? So that's why the timer was still kept on. And that's why this image is increasing and shrinking every time, because both these intervals are being set. That is, both expand and shrink is being called now, because both on mouse over and on mouse out were called. And before we actually could clear the interval, we never reached this stage, right? We never reached the else part because the width never increased or never reached 200. So that's why we have to use this clear interval at this stage also. That is before we actually call the set interval. Okay. So this will resolve that issue. So now if I hover it and remove it, you can see it is happening properly. Now I can increase and decrease the speed. I can say 10 milliseconds. If I hover it, it will happen a little faster.